Well, 3% actually sees us with the highest inflation in the G7, and we had the highest inflation in the G7 last year. So we are a high inflation country, and that's got nothing to do with the war in the Middle East. These figures relate to the time before that. And that's part of why we're in a fragile situation when it comes to leaning into those external shocks that are coming our way.
And like you said there, so these figures were collected before the Iran war started. How concerned are you about the future direction of prices?
So I think we should all be concerned. Clearly an elevated price of oil and gas is going to feed through to higher inflation, potentially an economic slowdown, and we're an open economy, so we'll be exposed to that. But the really important question is, how resilient is our economy to lean into those kind of challenges? And I'm afraid if you've got high inflation, you've got high and rising unemployment, low growth due to the choices of this government, then the answer to that question, I'm afraid, is we're far too fragile going into what is potentially a very significant external shock.
And you just mentioned it before about highest inflation of the G7. Do you feel that we're uniquely placed to be affected by this shock?
I think we're in a weak position. The public finances are under very significant strain. The so-called fiscal headroom that the government has at the moment could be wiped away easily by increased inflation and increased servicing costs on our national debt that will follow as a consequence of that. So I'm afraid the government's really been taking the wrong choices. They shouldn't be taxing as much as they are. They shouldn't be borrowing as much as they are. They should be getting control of public spending, particularly the welfare bill, getting people off benefits and into work.
And there's been some speculation that if oil stays at a sustained high, or perhaps even goes higher to around 150, we could see a global recession. How bad do you think this is going to get?
Well, I think it's difficult to speculate. Let's see where this war goes. I mean, if it is sorted out in the shorter term, then some of those scenarios won't play out. But clearly, if you get up to $150 or even higher for a prolonged period of time, that is going to be deeply difficult globally and also here in the UK. But you do need a resilient, strong, growing economy in order to effectively lean into those challenges. And I'm afraid the economy that this government has created is far from it.
And we've had a number of economic shocks in this decade. Do you think the public can withstand another cost of living crisis?
Well, if it depends how difficult it is, and that remains to be seen. That's contingent on what happens with the war in the Middle East. But the reality is that we need to really have an economy that's rather stronger, growing faster, lower inflation, lower unemployment than we have at the moment. And the fact that we're in the position we're in at the moment is due to the choices that the government took. Taxing a lot, borrowing a lot, spending a lot, stoking inflation, destroying jobs. I'm afraid that's been the history of the last 18 months of this government.
But we can't really blame the Chancellor for this, can we? Some economists were saying that inflation was coming down, possibly to around that 2% level that they wanted. But that's been completely derailed by this war, started by the Americans in Israel and initially supported by your party. Shouldn't we blame them instead?
Well, everybody, every country will be affected by what's happening in the Middle East. The critical question, though, is what is the state of your economy in terms of being able to face up to that challenge? And our economy, I'm afraid, is very weak because of the choices that the Chancellor has taken. If you increase taxes on businesses, you destroy jobs, you destroy growth. We've seen lots of borrowing, lots of spending. That's stoked inflation. So we've got the highest inflation in the G7 at the moment. And under those conditions, it makes it very difficult to lean into those challenges and protect people's livelihoods.
And just lastly, do you think Trump and Netanyahu should apologise for unleashing this economic chaos?
Well, I don't think we should get into whether people should be apologising or not. What we really need to see is an end to this conflict, and Iran really needs to step up and take any off-ramp that is offered to them, I think, so we can get the attacks on oil and energy assets in the region stopped, so that we can get the Strait of Hormuz open, get the oil and gas flowing again, and then ease the pressure on the global economy.
I know that when prices rise and incomes are squeezed, people look to the government and ask, what are you doing to help? That's why, since the election, we have delivered and funded 30 hours of free childcare to working parents, wages rising faster than prices for every month that I have been Chancellor, and free breakfast clubs being rolled out at our primary schools. From next week, the 2-child limit gone. Day one sick pay in, and another rise in the national living wage. prescription charges frozen, train fares frozen, the fuel duty frozen, and the state pension increasing next week by £575. And for businesses, £4.3 billion in business rate support. The Regulation Action Plan cutting admin costs for businesses. And the supercharger discount, followed next year by the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme to take money off business energy bills. But I know that there is more to do. On trade, I can confirm to the House that we are aiming to conclude negotiations with the EU this year on the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which will directly impact food prices in our shops. And I have asked officials to look at where there are targeted reductions to agri-food tariffs, which can help bring down food prices too, balancing this with implications on domestic producers and food security. And later this week, I am holding meetings with supermarkets and with banks to discuss how they can further support their customers. We have a world-class competition and consumer protection regime. And since my last statement, the Competition and Markets Authority have stepped up their statutory monitoring of fuel prices, and I will update on fuel pricing within the next month. They are working with government to monitor the cost of household essentials for both price rises and disruption, and they've launched a market study into heating oil. Today, I can announce that we are going further to make sure that the Competition and Markets Authority have the powers that they need that were denied to them by the previous government to detect and to crack down on price gouging, bringing in a new anti-profiteering framework and considering time-limited, targeted powers for the CMA and other regulators. This week, the Business Secretary and I will convene the Regulators' Council to discuss their work to protect consumers. Because let me say again, this government will not tolerate any company exploiting this crisis at consumers' expense. We don't yet know what the full impact of this conflict will be. So we must be agile in responding appropriately at each moment. We extended the 5p fuel duty cut, and we have pushed out the cheaper fuel finder, empowering people to avoid rip-off prices and chasing down the last few filling stations to reach 100% compliance. And when wholesale kerosene prices more than doubled overnight, we stepped in with £53 million of support to those who needed it most within a matter of days. And from next week, households will benefit from £150 off of their energy bills, thanks to the action that I took in my budget, with a price cap giving households certainty on their bills until July, ahead of the winter months when people use 78% of their gas. I can confirm to the House that contingency planning is taking place for every eventuality, so that we can keep costs down for everyone and provide support for those who need it most, acting within our ironclad fiscal rules to keep inflation and interest rates as low as possible. Mr. Speaker, this is not a war that we started, nor is it a war that we joined, unlike the advice of the parties opposite. But it is a war that will have an impact on our country. The challenges may be significant, but I promise to do what is right and fair, being responsive in a changing world and responsible in the national interest.